Good morning, everybody. Coming to you live on Facebook through our Alive and Thriving page and filming for YouTube there. So I'll make a point of emphasis to look majorly at the YouTube camera. So for you live Facebook live viewers, that's why I won't be looking directly at this camera right now. So we're going to be finishing up chapter 13 today. This is part 2, and if you remember from the previous part 1 of chapter 13, the Westerners, the Sojourners, Baird T, Spalding and his crew were traveling to a Baird home village where they were invited by the governor of that village to dine with them that evening. On the way there, they were met alongside the road by a young girl who asked that the masters come and heal her brother, who she feared had a broken spine. When the masters got to the house, not only did they heal the child, but they manifest or expanded the family's hovel to where it was a suitable, like studio-sized apartment at that point, with new furnishings and a bed for the child to lay upon. Then they made their way to the governor's village, where they were all seated in a grand room, and Baird began speaking about the similarities between Jesus the Christ and Buddha, the Celestial One. And the main comparisons that he was making was there have not these two men, I'll say it a different way, these two men more outshined all other examples of the Christ light or the cosmic unconditional love that God is during their embodiment in physical flesh, that being the Buddha and Jesus. So that was the recap from chapter 13, part 1. Now we're going to finish the chapter, and you are going to see an amazing twist take place in the Sojourners' story and experience of things, and then you're going to see two wonderful people make their entry into the story. Here, he held out his hand, and there was a circular disc of gold, somewhat larger than an English sovereign, in each hand. He passed them to those sitting at his right and left, and they, in turn, passed them on until the discs had made the rounds of the whole table. We preserved them and had them examined by experts who pronounced them pure gold. If you wish to assist others, see the Christ enthroned in them as he is in you, and speak to the Christ in them as though you were talking directly to them. Now, that is a powerful way to open up chapter 13, part 2, because it is, as Mother Teresa said, her reality was experienced during life. When asked how she was able to endure such slumly conditions her whole life in Calcutta and other places in the world, her response was, I don't see the poor, I don't see man, nor do I see woman, I just see Christ everywhere. This is exactly what the adept does. This is how their experience becomes as they live their life. They no longer see the ego of a person, the individuality of other people. They see the Christ within all, shielded or veiled to greater or lesser degree than others. But nonetheless, a true master can speak to the Christ within another master in becoming and coax that Christ light forward. By speaking to an individual's true identity, it does have a profound effect on them. All right. If you want to get a clearer view of any subject than you have at present, let the Christ speak mentally to the abstract soul of that subject or thing. Then ask the intelligence within the thing to tell you about itself. God's children are just as necessary to him in the carrying out of his perfect plan as any plant, flower, or tree is. And it is necessary for them to cooperate in the perfect way which he sees. It was the withdrawal of man from this perfect plan to cooperate that threw the world out of balance and caused great waves to sweep over and destroy the greater portion of his children. So here we're talking about the catalyst or the deluge that engulfed humanity at the end of the second great age. Humanity's time here on this planet during our current understanding can be understood as occurring in 3 waves. So you have the first wave ending at about 25,600 and some change years, and then the second one ending consequently this same amount of time after that, and then we are at the end of the third great human age. So with all of that said, the time of the flood, if you adhere to that chronology, occurred somewhere around 25,000 and change odd years ago. When it took place, it is said to have taken place because of an advanced civilization existing on the continent as we refer to it as Atlantis, activating some kind of technology that in the first great age of humanity they understood how to build and operate, but in the second great age not understanding how to do it fully, but in their egotism, assuming that they did still understand it, flipping the switch and then causing an electromagnetic discharge of such proportion that it actually ruptured time-space and caused dimensional tears to occur between lower density realities and higher density realities, thus resulting in the influx of what you might call souls or spirits from a lower realm, and the masters of a higher realm having to respond like firefighters to put out the fire or mend the tears in space-time. Nonetheless, the physical repercussions that happened because of this technology being activated serendipitously right at the end of the second great human age, because remember, God wastes not, and all things do happen according to divine right timing. So the time was ripe for the earth to go through earth changes, where the pole actually shifts on its axis. It makes an electromagnetic shift, so that when it realigns itself, our current North Pole as we know it today might be the tip of South Africa if a pole shift was to occur in this day and age. And then the mantle of the crust literally shifts in order to realign with that electromagnetism as it is oriented in space. And when that happened at the end of the second great human age, the whole entire continent of Atlantis was engulfed, is sunk into the sea, and then flash froze because the poles shifted. And where the most recent scholars place the continent of Atlantis is actually Antarctica. And it is said that highly secretive levels of our industrial military complex to date have been excavating Atlantis on the continent of Antarctica since the end of World War II. And if you want proof of this, of modern civilization actually making their way to Antarctica and finding it inhabitable underneath the surface of the ice in volcanically heated caverns, where the heat from the inner earth actually melts the ice to a certain extent and forms a cave that is then hospitable because algae grows, and I've even heard of incandescent, luminescent algae providing light at certain depths. Nonetheless, look into Operation High Jump, where the United States military sent an armada larger actually than the Normandy invasion force to Antarctica, and when they got down there, they were defeated by German craft that had the swastika painted on them, but they were not modern aircraft. They were actually Bell shaped craft that were capable of anti-gravitational lift. Now, I'm not going to go down that entire rabbit hole right now, but that is a documented occurrence in United States Army history, Operation High Jump being turned on its head, and for the Allies having to actually retreat back. Then we go down the whole entire Operation Paperclip trail, and after we get far enough down that trail, we realize that what we thought as of winning World War II was really not the way that history unfolded. Our GIs did win the physical land battle in Europe, but when it came to the ideological conquest of the United States and the infiltration that the Nazis were so good at, because they're like snakes, they got so far into American culture, and we are actually seeing the ramifications of that play out today with the far left trying to censor speech through Facebook, Twitter, and all of the organizations that they control, and with this soft coup that was just perpetrated against President Donald J. Trump. None of these things would have ever been allowed to occur if individuals adherent to the Constitution had remained in continuous state of power in the United States, and if our governing systems and our tech systems, and especially the mainstream media, had not been infiltrated by this ideological conquest that stems from might is right and only the strong survive, and by any means necessary accrue power and wield it over people. That is the ideology of the dark side, if you want to call it, but it's certainly the form of governance and persuasion that the Nazis and the Chinese Communist Party of today actually adhere to. I'm going to digress, because I've seriously digressed from the life and teaching of the Masters of the Far East, and get back onto the beautiful message that is every single one of us is the Christ. Okay. It was the withdrawal of man from this perfect plan to cooperation that threw the world out of balance and caused great waves to sweep over and destroy the greater portion of his children. It is the perfect thought of love cooperating with poison power in the hearts of God's children that holds the earth in balance. When they dissipate that force in thoughts of sin and lust, it swung so far out of balance that the great waves rushed over and nearly annihilated man and that work that he had accomplished. At that time, man had accomplished far more than he has today, but God cannot control man's thoughts of love and balance or hate and unbalance. They are for man to control. When the thought force that threw the earth out of balance was dissipated by the great cataclysm, and cataclysm is another word for deluge or engulfing the world in water, it had brought on, then God in his mighty power could restore the earth to its proper equilibrium or balance. But as long as man's thought held sway, God was powerless to act. Here, Bagaran ceased speaking and took his seat. So we go back here. If you've been following this channel for some time now, you'll remember a talk that I gave back when I was reading from book 1 about the way that thought emanates from our minds in a vibratory fashion, and how if you are in fear thoughts or discordant style thinking, you are sending out like jagged patterns, irregular heartbeats, if you will. Imagine the little graph that tracks your heartbeat. Imagine it being erratic and some points being much higher than others. That is a thought form signature of fear, and it is basically what the earth has been giving off through mankind's delusional style of thinking and wars and hatred for a long time. And even without the wars and without the hatred, the different ideological stances that we all hold, left-wing politics, right-wing politics, Muslims, Christians, Jews, Buddhists, fanatics, and zealots, and all of these different ways that thought emanates from the human mind, it's like you're sending out rockets of desire in every which way, and it is just this continuous outflowing of thought energy. And when it is coming out in such concentrated fashions on this side of the globe and not as concentrated fashions on this side of the globe, or confused and even more confused and a little bit less confused, and just all of these different thought waves emanating out from the planet, God is a very, very subtle form of vibration. It's a pure love energy, but it's very subtle. When we're sending out such dense and harsh thought energy, that love is always there. It's passing through all of that, but it doesn't have a massive effect on mass humanity because humanity is too busy broadcasting and not spending any time receiving. So that's what they mean by God couldn't really do anything. God is always doing something. He is always influencing the hearts of subtle and the pure. But if you're dense and you're broadcasting 24/7, 365, you leave yourself closed to reception. And that is ultimately what you have to do when you are contacting God. You receive the Holy Spirit into you. It's not a you go out and you force something to happen. It's a receptive state of just accepting what is already there, permeating through all things at all times. We had noticed then that our host, the governor, had betrayed signs of uneasiness and considerable excitement. And when Bagadaran took his seat, our host's excitement burst forth in an exclamation which carried the meaning of dog! Dog of a Christian! You have defamed the name of our fair Buddha, and you shall suffer. At this, he pulled a cord that hung from the ceiling near him, and instantly 3 doors flew open, and the opposite end of the room from where he was sitting, and rushed 30 soldiers with drawn swords. He had risen from his seat at the table, and the 2 guards who had accompanied him were standing just back of his chair during the meal, stepped forward to his side. Raising his hand, he gave an order. 10 of the soldiers came forward and arranged themselves along the wall back of where Baggett was sitting. 2 stepped forward and took their stand just back of and on each side of his chair. The commander then walked forward and stood at attention a short distance from where the governor and his 2 guards had stood. Not a word had been spoken by any of the company, and scarcely a move had been made. We sat then completely overcome by the suddenness of the change. Then a deep silence seemed to fall, and a strong light blazed forth in the room at the head of the table just in front of where the governor stood. Every eye was upon his face as he stood with upraised hand, as though about to give another order, but his face was ashen pale, and a look of horror had come over him. A dim form seemed to be standing on the table before him, and all heard the word "stop" pronounced clearly and very forcefully, and the word itself stood out in flaming letters between the dim form and the governor. The governor seemed to understand, for he stood as though transfixed and as rigid as a statue. By this time, the dim form had taken definite shape, and we recognized it was that of Jesus, as he had seen him before, as we had seen him before. But the thing that amazed us was that another dim form was standing beside him, and it was this form that was holding the attention of the governor and all the soldiers. They seemed to recognize and to fear the dim form that stood by the side of Jesus far more than they did Jesus. As we looked around, they were standing perfectly rigid. As the second form grew more distant, it raised its hand, and Jesus, as Jesus had done, And at this, every sword fell from the soldiers' hands, clattering then to the floor. The room re-echoed with the sound, so deep was the stillness. The light seemed to glow with a far greater intensity. Indeed, so intense did the light become that we could scarcely see. The commander was the first to recover. He stretched forth his hands, exclaiming, "Buddha, our Buddha, the Sublime One." Then the governor exclaimed, "It is indeed the Sublime One," and threw himself prostrate on the floor. The two guards stepped forward and assisted him to his feet, then stood silent and immovable as statues. A shout went up from the soldiers, who had arranged themselves at the far end of the room. They rushed pell-mell along each side of the table and crowded together at the head, shouting, "The Sublime One has come to destroy the dogs of Christians and their leaders." At this, Buddha stepped back upon the table until he could look them all in the face and raised his hand with the words, "It is not once that I say stop, not twice that I say stop, but 3 times that I say stop." Each time when he pronounced the word, it appeared in flaming letters as it had when Jesus had pronounced it, and the words did not disappear. They remained. The crowd of soldiers again stood and stared as though transfixed, some with their hands in the air, some with 1 foot from the floor, in the attitude in which they happened to be at the instant Buddha had raised his hand. He again walked to where Jesus stood, and placing his left hand under Jesus' raised arm, said, "In this, as in all things, I support the upraised hand of my dear brother Jesus." Then he placed his right hand upon Jesus' shoulder, and they stood in this attitude for a moment. They both then stepped lightly from the table, while the governor, commander, guards, and soldiers fell back, staring at them with blank, ashen faces. The governor sank into his chair that had been moved back until it was against the wall of the room, and every one of the company gave vent to a sigh of relief. I think scarcely one of us had drawn a full breath during the few minutes it took that exact scene to take place. Then Buddha locked his arms in that of Jesus, and the two walked directly in front of the governor. In words that were thrown from him with such force that they seemed to rebound from the walls, Buddha said, "Dare you for one moment call these our dear brothers Christian dogs? You, who but a short time since ruthlessly cast aside a little child who was pleading for help for a loved one? This dear great soul here turned aside and heeded the call." Here he dropped Jesus' arm, turned, and with hand extended toward Emil's mother, stepped forward to her. As he continued, he turned halfway around so that he could look from the governor to Emil's mother. It was plainly seen that he was deeply stirred. He fairly flung the words from him as, looking at the governor, he continued, "You, who should have been the first to respond to the call of that dear child, shirketh your duty, and then you call the one that did respond a Christian dog. Go and see the restored child, whose body but a moment before was torn and writhing in anguish. See the comfortable home that has been reared from that hovel that your acts are partially responsible for thrusting upon these dear ones. See the miserable heap of filth and rags that this dear soul," turning to Emil, "raised that child's body from. See how tenderly he raised him and placed him in a clean, neat couch. Then see how, after he had raised the little body, the filth and rags disappeared. And you, licentious bigot that you are, were sitting at ease in the purple that is to be worn only by those that are pure. You dare to call these that have in no way harmed you or another Christian dogs, and you call yourself the follower of Buddha, the high priest of the temple here? Shame! 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 It seemed that every word would hit the governor, the chair, and the draperies around him and rebound. At any rate, they were sent with such force that the governor trembled and the draperies fluttered as though they were blown by a strong wind. There was no question of an interpreter. The governor did not need one. He understood perfectly, although the words were spoken in the purest of English. Buddha turned and walked to the two men who had received the gold pieces and asked if he might have them. They handed the disc to him, and with these in his open hand, he walked back to the governor and addressed himself directly to him, saying, "Put forth your hands." The governor did so, but they were trembling so greatly that he could scarcely hold them out. Buddha dropped a disc in each hand, and almost instantly it disappeared. Buddha said, "See, even pure gold will fly from your hands." And the two discs landed almost simultaneously on the table before the two men that had first received them. Buddha reached out both hands, placed them on the governor's outstretched hands, and in a mild, calm voice said, "Brother, you need not fear. I do not judge you. You are only judging yourself." He held his hands thus and stood quietly until the governor became calm. Then he removed his hands and said, "You are quick to fly with your swords, to redress what you judge to be wrong. But remember, when you are judging and condemning others, you are judging and condemning yourself." He returned to Jesus' side and he said, "We who know stand together for the common good and brotherly love of all mankind." He again linked his arms with Jesus and said, "Well, brother, I think I took this affair out of your hands entirely. It is all in your hands now." Jesus replied, "You have done nobly, and I cannot thank you enough." They turned and bowed, then arm in arm walked through the door and disappeared. The room at once broke into a hubbub of voices. The governor, commanders, soldiers, and guards all crowded around to shake our hands. Everybody was trying to make himself understood at the same time. The governor spoke to Emil, and he raised his hands for silence. As soon as he could be heard, he said the governor would like us again to be seated at the table. When all had resumed their seats and quiet had been restored, we saw that the commander had drawn the soldiers back into formation at each side of the table and back of the governor's chair, which had been drawn near then to the table. The governor arose and, with Emil acting as interpreter, said, "I allowed my zeal to get the better of me, for which I am heartily ashamed and doubly sorry. I do not think it is necessary for me to say this after what has happened. I believe you can see by my attitude that I have changed, and I wish to ask Brother Baggett to arise and accept my most humble apology. Now, will the whole company arise?" After they had risen, he said, "I ask you all to kindly accept my most humble apology. I extend to you all a most heartily welcome, and if you so desire, I hope you will stay among us always. If you wish a military escort at any time, which I judge you do not, I shall, and I know the commander here will also, deem it a high honor to be of service to you. I cannot say more. I bid you all good night. Before you go, I wish to say that everything I have is at your command. I salute you, and the soldiers salute you also, and they will escort you to your quarters. Again, I bid you good night, and salam to you in the name of the great Buddha, the Celestial One. The commander, making profuse apologies and saying that he was certain we were in league with the Celestial One, with 5 of his soldiers, escorted us to our quarters. As they left, they gave us a salute, which is executed by forming a half circle around the commanding officer, then presenting their swords so that their points just touch to the point of their commander's sword. Then they turned quickly, swept off their hats, and salaamed very low, touching one knee to the ground. This salute is given only on great state occasions. We accepted the salute as best we knew, and they departed. We went into the house, immediately took leave of our friends and host, and prepared to go to our tent. There were so many of us that the rest of the house could not accommodate us all, so our camp had been set up in the enclosure at the rear of the house. As we reached our camp, the leader sat down on a camp cot and said, "Although I am dead tired, there is absolutely no use in my going to bed before I know something more. And I am going to serve notice that I intend to sit here all night unless I am somewhat enlightened. I can tell you that this thing has gone much farther than skin deep for me tonight. You fellows sit around and say nothing and appear as wise as owls. Who told him he knew as much as we, for we had never before been witness to anything like that?" Someone suggested that it had been staged for our special benefit. The leader fairly jumped at him. "Staged? Why, man, the crowd that could stage anything like that would be worth $1 million a week of anyone's money. And the governor, if he was acting, well, you can choke me, for that old fellow was thoroughly frightened. And I'm going to admit that I, for a few moments, was just about as frightened as he. Away back somewhere, there was a dim suggestion that that old fellow had a red-hot reception staged for all of us. That outburst was not just for Baird and Rand. When those soldiers came rushing forward, there was too much of a triumphant note in their voices. If I'm not mistaken, they were all in on a deeper play than we were aware of. That same something suggests that for a moment, they thought Buddha had come to help them. When they saw the whole scheme had gone against them, their very bodies dropped, and when I think of it, I remember that they dropped their swords. Say, did not Buddha have power? Just see how he threw those words at the old governor. He seemed much more powerful than Jesus did. But then, it was his side that needed bolstering up, for our side, under the circumstances, had all the best of that event. But didn't the old governor get a boost? I'll bet by this time he feels like lifting himself over a fence by his own bootstraps. When Buddha clasped his hands, it actually looked to me as though the fellow jumped right out of his old self. We're going to hear a lot more of him before another sun, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm going to predict that it is good, for that old one is a power in this land. If he got the wonderful uplift that I did out of all of that, I would not mind being in his boots after all. We talked of the things we had seen and heard, and before we realized how the time was passing, dawn began to break. The leader arose, stretched his arms above his head, and said, "Who needs any sleep? I don't believe I do, after listening to you talk." We lay down, fully dressed, for an hour's rest before breakfast. Thus ends the reading of Part 2, Chapter 13, Book 2, Life and Teaching of the Masters of the Far East. And the only thing that I really want to touch on here is something that I have been personally working on for years now, and that is when you judge others, you only judge yourself. And it's gotten to the point for me that it's not so much I judge others anymore, it's that I judge myself. And a lot of the times, it's erroneous. I can be my own worst critic, and in the past, I'm sure that you have been as well. But what the masters here are saying is that if you perceive yourself as anything other than the pure white light of Christ, and you judge that thing which you deem is something other, or you recognize as something other than the pure white light of Christ, then you are in fact judging an other, right? Because it is in your own mortal mind that you have conceived of this separation, our own mortal minds, that we've conceived of this separation between ourselves and the divine, and then we label ourselves as something other than that, and then we judge that thing, and it never feels good. So not only are we entertaining duality and delusion and an illusion of separation from God, but then we're going as far as condemning ourselves for doing it in the first place, but our aim is misdirected. So we're all kinds of lost. We're all kinds of, I was going to use something from my Marine Corps days, but yeah, we're all kinds of messed up because we're not even hitting the mark, yet we're condemning something, and then we feel the negative emotions associated with that. And if you take it on too far or too long, you can depress yourself. And you can really start to loathe yourself. And then you start to engage in acts of self-destruction. And nothing good ever becomes of walking that path, save the redemption. And the redemption happens when you begin to fully grok this concept of non-duality, no self, as one of the most famous things to come from the Buddha ever was, no self. That you're not a separate entity. There is no self existing separate from the collective. It is an illusion. It is an adopted ego or personality that perceives separation. So if there truly is no self, then there is no thing to judge and condemn when you are doing that to others or to yourself for any kind of actions or words or deeds or thoughts that you've had. If we can grok that concept, then we are not only one step closer to fully yoking ourselves to the ultimate will of God, which is to have every single one of his children recognize and boldly and rightfully claim their inheritance, which is joint heirs in the kingdom of Christ, if I remember correctly from a few chapters ago. Once we're able to do that, not only have we done that, but we're no longer associating our self as a separate entity apart, above, or beyond, or below that of the Christ light. Now I will say this. It's not going to happen overnight that you grok the concept of no self, or that you fully yoke yourself with the will of God. It's a gradual unfolding process. No one in nature or in divine thought expects a drop of water that enters into the Mississippi River up in Canada or wherever its head is. Forgive me, I'm not that great with the geology of the Mississippi River. But nobody expects a drop of water that enters at the head of the Mississippi to make it to the Gulf of Mexico instantly. It's a gradual process. And we usually start out as a very purified drop of water when we enter the river's head. And we usually come out the other side as a sediment-laden, muddy thing. And it is by then the divine right timing of the clouds to part and the sun, God's warmth and light, to radiate through that parting of the clouds at divine right timing, which heats up the water where we just so happen to be serendipitously, and then purify us by changing our state of vibration so that we go from being a liquid or a physical body, which has the ability to hold in trauma, hold on to negative things, sediment, change our vibration, whereas we cast off all of those things because they just can't stay with us. They're physical little pieces of dirt. And we're now this gaseous water vapor. So it's not able to cling to us. And we rise and we rejoin the larger body that is the universal. Now, I could go deeper and farther on the cloud analogy and how that cloud is not the ultimate destination, because if you stop there, then you're destined for rebirth. You're going to come back to Earth as a water drop, that the aim is to ultimately go even higher and even further until one is fully re-amalgamated with divinity, with Source. I'll leave it there for today. I wish everybody a very wonderful Wednesday, and good news on my home front. Work has been really taken off. I'm getting ready to launch another stage of my solar business. So if you live anywhere in Florida and you were curious about what solar panels could do for you, I would love to have that conversation. And then 2, I'm actually buying a house. So we are going to have a new home base of operations with a brand new studio for producing these videos and more going on into the future. And I am super excited for that chapter to begin. So, with love and light, I wish you nothing but blessings this wonderful Wednesday. Namaste.